More often, I hear from some experts, that economical experts, that if the sanctions issue regarding Russia would happen 10 years ago or 20 years ago, that would probably stop them from war in Ukraine, but not now. What is your take on that? Because you're saying that it won't stop them, but at the same time, I'm reading IMF sees Russia's wartime economy slowing after 2 strong years after the full-scale invasion. So we should not react optimistic on such kind of news, right?
No, the basic sanction against Russia's economy could be the dramatic lowering of oil prices. And Donald Trump has understood it for ages. During his presidential campaign last year, he said that if the oil price would be $40 per barrel, so Putin would never start his war. It's true. It's 100% true. But the question is how to achieve it, how to do it. It's very much dependent on the Persian Gulf countries, and they are not prepared to such kind of oil price war against Russia. They are prepared for some inconsiderable decrease, for instance, $60 per barrel, which is painful for Russia as well, because Russia's budget has been for 2025 has been prepared on the basis of oil price 69.7. And now, because of the discount of Russian oil, Russian Urals discount reaching $10, $12 per barrel due to sanctions and because of sanctions, because certainly the budget deficit is a real problem for Russia, but it can still be resolved for the coming, by the end of 2026. Russia it wouldn't be crucial for Russia's economy and Russia's financial, Russian state finances. Russia still has sources to compensate, to cover it. And Putin, of course, is hopeful to finish the war in Ukraine by the second half of 2026. He's hopeful to finish it within this year. But if we are talking not just of objective picture of Russia's economy, but of Putin's perception of it, as far as his perception is concerned, of course, he's not afraid of any problems with economy, not afraid of sanctions. What he's really afraid of, and has been afraid since his childhood, which is important source of problems stemming deeply in his psychology, his security, of course, his personal security.
Yeah, personal security. What if under the sanctions there are Putin's elite circle, oligarch circle? You know, you probably heard that Russian-born oil tycoon Yevgen Shvidler has lost his legal challenge at the UK Supreme Court to overturn sanctions imposed on him by the British government in 2022, and now his assets remain frozen, and he has ties to Roman Abramovich. What signal it gives to the world that to be connected to Putin or people close to Putin can be very painful, or there is no.
It's been painful. It's been painful for many Russian tycoons for the past 3 years, and for several tycoons, especially personally tied to Putin for the past 11 years since Crimea annexion. But it hasn't impacted Kremlin's position dramatically toward the questions of war and peace, because Putin cannot be impacted in such questions. And Russian oligarchs, though being still influential in different questions and fields, cannot influence him with regard to Ukraine and the destiny of Ukraine. And mentioned Eugene Shvidler as American citizen, by the way, who's never been Russia's citizen. He's been Soviet citizens and emigrated to the United States, become American citizen. And he's not a first-rank tycoon close to Putin. Through Roman Abramovich, he's connected to Kremlin, of course. And Roman Abramovich is a person who's taken a very important part in bringing Putin to power in late 1990s. Of course, he's still close to Putin, but in my opinion, at least three at least 70–80% of Russian tycoons were very deeply interested in ceasefire and putting stop to the war, and even prepared themselves, both psychologically and from business point of view, for such ceasefire and the pact between Trump and Putin this spring. And they were bitterly disappointed about the absence of this pact and about this march of events proved unreal. But at the same time, they can do nothing about this war, which is to a very considerable extent Putin's personal war. I would emphasize again, as I've told many times, if Russia's president were another person, even more dim than Putin, more harsh than Putin, more consecutive autocrat and enemy of democracy than Putin, but not Putin himself, the probability of the war with Ukraine could be much, much lower.
Yeah. And the final thing that dragged my attention, the news these days from our neighbors, Poland, that their Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, has stated that 32 people were detained in Poland for suspected cooperation with Russian and Belarusian intelligence. And they were doing some arsons, and they were destabilize Poland on purpose, of course. Why do you think Poland now? Is this something unique? Is Moscow somehow punishing them for supporting Ukrainians so strongly since 2022? Or isn't that related to each other?
I don't think we see something dramatically new in it. Yeah. It's a hybrid world war launched by Kremlin in 2014. And Kremlin's prepared for this hybrid world war since 2007, when we heard this infamous Putin's Munich speech. Yeah, so 7 years of preparation, then the world hybrid war started. The world war, now we are talking a lot about the probability of the Third World War. Mm-hmm. But in my opinion, the Third World War is over for many years. It was a Cold War, which ended in 1989 on the remains of Berlin Wall. Now we are living under the conditions of the Fourth World War, of course, a specific war, not too similar to first and second ones of the 20th century, because it's a hybrid war. And it started with the annexion of Crimea in late February 2014. And during all this period, Russia has been very active in military and intelligence fields against the collective West and European countries, and even against its main ally, China, which now is widely being disclosed through different sources. So Putin is prepared for the world war and for many years of this war, and we should not underestimate it, this willingness, his readiness for war, and his understanding that the war itself is the source of his youth, the source of his new identity, the source of his understanding of his righteousness of his cause, and the explanation why he should stay as Russian ruler for many years by and before his death. The war is the source of his energy for him. That's why it's not so easy to get Vladimir Putin from the path of the war, even if he reaches his dim goals in Ukraine, it wouldn't mean the war is over. That's why I think Europe's preparation for any kind of future full-scale war with Russia is basing on the reliable understanding what Putin's psychology really is, what Putin's psychological priorities really is, taking into consideration that Putin is a personalistic regime, and Russia as a country, Russia as a statehood, is very deeply dependent on his own and personal psychological priorities.
But in that case, Russia needs a lot of allies to fight with Europe, or not?
The past 11 years of this hybrid war showed us that Putin was, to a certain extent, successful in creating the coalitions of supporters.
Yeah.
He has some relationship with China, which allows him to get to be sufficient in psychological field and to sell the oil. He's got sources of help and aid from Iran and North Korea. He controls Belarus, of course, unwillingly for Alexander Lukashenko, who wanted to balance between different key forces on the global scene. But after the August 2020, of course, there was no way out for Lukashenko but to submit himself to Putin 100%. He hates Putin, but has no way out now. So Putin is quite sure that he was played on contradictions between Western countries, between America and Europe, inside Europe, taking into consideration the European dissidents like Hungary and Slovakia, actually supporting Moscow and Kremlin in many ways and in many aspects. He's hopeful that some new elite groups would come to power in Europe. For instance, right-wing groups like Alternative for Germany or something like, who would change European policies, because he has time. He has time to wait. He has time to maintain the currently existing level of war for a couple of years, when the surrounding world could change in his favor. That's the way Putin thinks, and the past 11 years have given him many proofs, many reasons to think in such way. We should not underestimate it as well.
The economy of Russia is not collapsing, but it's not stable anymore. What is your take on that? After more than 3 years of a full-scale invasion, how we can see the Russian economy? Is it far away from collapsing?
Well, look, the one person who knew he was going to invade Ukraine was Putin, right? He planned for this invasion, I would say, way back to 2014, right? He saw Western sanctions initially after the annexation of Crimea, and what he did was he built buffers. He built Russia's foreign exchange reserves to $630 billion just before the invasion. He deleveraged the economy. He reduced vulnerabilities, right? Because he was going to invade. He expected Western sanctions, and he wanted the Russian economy to be durable. Secondly, I'd say Western sanctions have been too weak, too late, too well telegraphed. Russia's had lots of time to figure out ways to get around them. So, we've been too soft. So, the fact that Russia's been able to survive for 3.5 years is not a huge surprise. We could have done a lot more to hurt Russia, to reduce Russia's ability to wage war in Ukraine. I mean, in the end, it goes back to the same conversation we had about frozen Russian assets. Essentially, there's been a lack of leadership from Western politicians. Sanctions, they're not a silver bullet. They are complicated. Typically the sanctions hurt the country you're sanctioning, but they also hurt you. There is a price to be paid for imposing sanctions, especially in an interconnected world, a globalized world, right? And I think what we've learned is that Western countries have not been willing to pay a price for damaging the Russian economy. They've not been willing to have a cost imposed on themselves. And actually, in the end, if you think about it, the message there is they haven't thought that the threat to them from Russia is sufficient enough to make imposing aggressive sanctions that hurt themselves. In that basic calculation, I think they essentially have miscalculated the risks and threat from Russia, right? If they were serious about the threat from Russia, they would do whatever it takes to impose aggressive enough sanctions to significantly hurt the Russian economy, right? So, that's where we are, unfortunately. The Russian economy is pretty durable. It's a war economy. It's guns versus butter. Resources have been diverted from consumption to defense. Sanctioned countries figure out ways to get around sanctions. That's just one of the realities. We also haven't done enough in terms of secondary sanctions, right? Lots of people, lots of countries, lots of companies are helping Russia break sanctions. We should have made sure that it's absolutely crystal clear. The message is, if you help Russia break sanctions, you will have a penalty imposed on you, either jail terms or significant financial penalties. Not really any of that's happened. No one's gone to jail for helping Russia break sanctions. In fact, it's been profitable for those countries, companies and individuals who have helped Russia break sanctions. They've made a lot of money. So that's why there's been interest to do that. So we need to be clever in terms of sanctions. We can hurt Russia. We need to do more.
Mr. Ash, you said there is a lack of, leadership in the question, in the issue of Russian frozen assets in the world. Who, from your perspective, potentially could be that person or country who will take that leadership on them?
Well, it just takes one of the G7 countries. I mean, in reality, most of the immobilized Russian assets are in the European Union, right? 180 billion are in Belgium, significant amounts are in France.
Yes.
I think about 50, 60 billion in France, about 20, 30 in the UK, about the same in the US. I mean, ideally, it would be the European Union.
In total. Okay.
But I think if the Biden administration or the Trump administration had just said, you need to do this to Europe, Europe would do it, right? So, I think it needs one of the G7 countries to show some leadership, take the lead, show it can be done. And I think if they do that, I think others will follow. But, the US has significant leverage. So I think the US could have done it a long time ago. Biden administration should have done it before it left office. It dithered. It wanted the Europeans to make the decision. It wanted to keep Western unity. I mean, I think what we've learned, again, from the sanctions regime is, by trying to maintain that Western unity, you end up with very slow decision-making, and you end up with sanctions by the highest common denominator. What ends up happening is you have a very weak policy response.
Yes, Mr. Ash, you're absolutely right. I mean, I read more and more from experts and economists that sanctions doesn't work and they do not hurt Russia. If they were imposed, I've heard the idea, if they were imposed like 10 or 20 years ago, they would potentially have another impact on Russia, but not now. And I was thinking, do wars really end through economic pressure? Or as history often shows, do they end because one side becomes too weak on the battlefield?
Well, initially, I think Western sanctions were imposed on Russia because of the annexation of Crimea. The West wanted to send a signal to Russia, don't do this, get out of Crimea, get out of Donbass. After the full-scale invasion, again, it was retreat, pull out of Ukraine. I think now, for Europe in particular, I think there's a realization that sanctions are important to weaken the Russian economy long term, because ultimately we are at war with Russia, and we need to make sure that the Russian war machine, the military-industrial complex, is not able to regenerate itself, and sanctions help that undoubtedly. Sanctions help weaken the Russian economy. They need to be maintained in place and tightened, so that in this battle of military-industrial complexes, Europe wins and Russia doesn't win, right? So you're right. I mean, in the end, victories in long wars are about resource mobilization and allocation, right? Why did the Allies beat Nazi Germany in the Second World War? Because of the involvement of the US and its vast economic might, right? In this case, again, Russia is a relatively small economy, $2 trillion. Europe is 15 times larger. It should be able to beat Russia economically and then militarily, but we're not clever. We're not using the resources fully at our disposal, using those immobilized Russian assets, but also in rolling out much more aggressive sanctions on Russia will weaken Russia, weakens Russia's military machine.
Yeah, absolutely. War is always about money. It's always about resources. For how long, for how many years do you think Russia is capable to continue this aggressive war against Ukraine?
Look, I mean, yes, it can continue, for years ahead.
For years ahead, yeah.
But there are risks for Putin. We saw the Prigozhin affair. No one expected that. The longer the war goes on, the more casualties, the more economic consequences. Putin, can not be assured that there would not be something internally, an internal coup against him. I'm not saying it's inevitable, it's going to happen next week, but it's a risk factor for him. And his decision is also dependent on what we do. If we, the West, the Trump administration, decide to massively increase arms supplies to Ukraine, to put them in a position where they're better able to defend themselves, perhaps go on the offensive, and we impose sanctions that significantly weaken the Russian economy, that changes Putin's decision set and probably makes him more willing to come to the negotiating table. I do think that whoever won the US election last year, Putin did want to negotiate at that point in time. It's just unfortunate, I think, that the Trump administration seems to have missed an opportunity. They showed weakness in response to Putin. They should have shown strength. Putin now thinks he gets everything from a long war, whereas I think maybe 6 months ago, I think the calculation was a little bit different. I think he could see advantage in negotiating some kind of settlement.
Mr. Ash, could you please describe how the ideal sanctions would look like to stop Russia from this war in Ukraine?
So easy ones. Seize the $330 billion of immobilized Russian assets, create a sovereign wealth fund to manage Ukraine's interests, to invest it, to generate significant returns annually. It could be $30, $40 billion. That could be used to fund Ukraine's defense. That's the first thing. Secondly, I would increase secondary sanctions. I would impose significant financial penalty on companies, individuals, and countries that help Russia break sanctions, tighten up the existing sanctions regime we have. I think, interestingly, there's a lot of focus on 100% tariff that has been suggested by the Trump administration. I think it's unrealistic, frankly, because, as I said, it's likely to significantly impact global energy prices, which means it's less likely to happen. I think, actually, a tax on Russian exports by G7 countries, 10 to 15%, something like that, which is doable. If you think about it, Russian exports are about 300, 400 billion a year. 10, 15% tax on that would, again, generate really significant monetary flows. It would also take money out of Russia's exchequer. I think that could also be quite powerful. I think, actually, another idea would be signaling to international business that you should not be doing any trade with Russia, and setting a target date, say, relatively long time frame, 3, 4, 5 years ahead, would actually be useful in terms of it would allow a transition period. I would say zero trade with Russia unless you get licenses. So it would force the default is you can't do business unless you get a specific license. You have to justify why you need to trade with Russia. I think what this would do was it would significantly slow down trade and investment into Russia. It would make international business think, why are we doing this? Why do we need to trade with Russia? And I think that would have, again, a long-term drain and impact on the Russian economy.